Good afternoon. Welcome to our talk on whether millennials are leading a back to the city movement or moving to the suburbs. I'm David Luberoff, the Deputy Director of the Joint Center, and it's my privilege to host this session. Let me tell you about a couple of upcoming events before we get into today's. On November 3rd at noon, we will host University of Washington professor Greg Colburn, co-author of Homelessness as a Housing Problem, an important book that came out last year, and Lyndia Downey, head of the Pine Street Inn, the largest homeless service provider in New England, for a special session that's the second in a series of talks we'll be doing over the academic year on issues related to homelessness. That'll be a hybrid event, in person at the Harvard Kennedy School and online via Zoom. 2 weeks after that, on Friday, November 17th, from 2 to 6 p.m., we're going to have a half-day event releasing our new State of Housing Design 2023 book. That event's going to feature panels and presentations with several of the authors of the essays in the book's editors, some practitioners whose work is featured in the book, and other practitioners, scholars, and writers. That will also be a hybrid event. It'll be in person at the Graduate School of Design and available online off of the GSD's streaming platform. You can find more information about that event and other Joint Center activities on our website. Now on to today's presentation. I'm really excited to welcome back Hyojung Lee. Hyojung is currently an assistant professor of urban planning at Seoul National University, but back in the day, he was a postdoctoral fellow here at the center. It wasn't that long ago, but it was pre-pandemic. He'll be discussing research he's done with two of our Joint Center colleagues, Whitney Airgood-Obrycki and Riordan on whether millennials have led a back to the city movement or whether, like previous generations, they're moving to the suburbs. Hyojung will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have questions, wrapping up at about 1:15. You can submit questions via Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance if we don't get to all of your questions. I do want to note that Whitney and Riordan are both in the background, and they'll be answering some of the questions that can be answered online. They'll be typing those answers, so keep an eye out for that on your screens. As I said, we'll end at about 1:15 p.m. Video and slides from today's presentation will be posted by early next week. And with that, Hyojung, it's all yours. Welcome back.
So let me share my screen first. Does everything look okay? Right. So hello, everyone. Thank you, David, for introducing me, and thank you all for coming here today. So my name is Hyojung Lee. I know it's hard to pronounce my name, but it's Hyojung. And I'm very happy to be here, back to Cambridge, Boston, and then back to the Joint Center seminar, as I recently moved from Joint Center to Virginia Tech and then to Seoul National University. And now I'm at Chris, the managing director's office. So once Chris knows this, he will get mad, but I like it. This is the best room that you can find in the Joint Center. So today I'm going to share what I've done with my great colleagues, Whitney and Riordan at the Joint Center on millennials and their residential locations in the last decade. But before we dive into the issue, there's an obvious question or questions to answer. So who are millennials and why do we have to care about them? So in this section, let me very briefly explain the definition of the millennials and their importance. First, who are millennials? While we talk a lot about millennials, but there's no consensus on how we define them. So vaguely, they are children of baby boomers. Some argues that they are those who are born in like 1982 to 2002, or somebody else argues that it's 1977 to 1997, etc., etc. But in this paper, for analytical convenience, we define millennials as those born between 1977 and 1996, because this definition makes them to be 25 to 44 years old in 2021. And in this paper, we are particularly interested in those early millennials who were born between 1977 and 1986. They were 25 to 34 in 2011 and were 35 to 44 in 2021. Then why should we care about that? So arguably, they are pretty important in many ways as they are massive population, meaning having about 90 million members among 330 million, US population, and have very unique characteristics. So for example, they are the most racially and ethnically diverse generation in US history. So if you compare those racial composition of millennials to those racial composition among boomers, you can obviously can see there are more racial and ethnic minorities. Um, and then they are familiar with new technologies like iPhone or cloud services or using some shared cars, etc., etc. And they value walkability and multimodal and then living in more kind of urbanish kind of environment. And they are important for urban planners and policymakers as they have potential to reshape future urban landscape. Like boomers did in 1970s and 1980s, millennials' choice will reshape our society, including housing market and urban structure. Indeed, when millennials reached to ages 25 to 34, they substantially contributed to like urban revival during 2000 and 2010s. And given that it seems like they prefer urban living. Some people argues that the emergence of the millennials will reshape our urban kind of landscape into more kind of, compact and sustainable one. But nobody knows whether that urban living was due to their taste or preferences, or that was simply due to kind of economic hardship, so that was kind of short-term adjustment. And they are now at the very crucial moment, which I call the Bing moment. No, it is not Microsoft Bing or fancy AI kind of machine learning term, but it is about, well, Chandler and Monica Bing. So, if you're a fan of the sitcom Friends, you may remember the episode in that Monica and Chandler decide to leave their apartment in Manhattan after they adopting a baby and buying a suburban home. And when they revealed this kind of plan, the rest of the gang were kind of shocked and furious about the idea. And they argued that, Monica and Chandler could not live in such a kind of dull and boring place unless they were beavers. And it is understandable, they had lived in the center of the world, Manhattan, New York, for more than 10 years, and the city that has like everything, like 24-hour restaurants, bars, events, lots of the things, right? But Monica and Chandler needed a new place for their baby, a place in where their kids could ride their bikes down the street and then run after an ice cream truck. And they had to admit the fact that it was the end of the era, right? So they are not 20 something anymore, and they are now grown up parents. And now millennials at that moment, as they are hitting 30s and 40s now. Actually, I'm one of them. I'm one of those in the first wave of millennials. I thought we were the coolest generation in the human history. We used iPhone 4 and then posting selfies on Facebook and Instagram and shared our homes and cars using the app. But now, I have to admit that I'm old-fashioned person a little bit as I don't have any kind of TikTok account. And I have to confess that, I like a large suburban home. And sometimes, Toyota Sienna or Honda Odyssey look, okay. And now millennials have to admit that we are at that kind of moment. With that, I'd like to show where they are moving from and to based on most up-to-date census data set. And so basically what we are doing is to examine where millennials are moving in terms of, big metros and small metros, and then some neighborhood types within those metros. In doing so, we analyze the changes in the share of early millennials in different types of the neighborhoods from 2011 to 2021. So share of early millennials is a key idea. So here's an example. So in 2011, there were about 2.7 million hip and sexy kind of early millennials lived in urban, New York Metro. And here they are. So in 2021, they became like 35 to 44 years old. Some became parents, others were not. Still, all noticed that they were getting older. And the number declined to 2.6 million in New York as those early millennials age into 30s and 40s. And when we think about the number of early millennials in the entire nation, those would be interpreted as 6.6% and 6.2% of early millennials in 2011 and 2021. And we can say that, millennial population share declined in New York Metro by zero point 0.4 percentage points, and somewhere else gained that kind of millennial population share during the same period as the entire population distribution shifted in that way. So using this kind of concept, what we did was we calculate the number and share of millennials in four different neighborhood categories, which I'm going to explain later. When they were 25 to 34 years old in 2011 and 35 to 44 years old in 2021, and analyze that kind of changes in the millennial population share across different types. And ultimately, we'll compare these kind of millennial mobility patterns with those among late boomers from 1990 to 2000 and Gen Xers from 2010 when they were 25 to 34 years old and then 35 to 44 years old. And here's how we classify our neighborhood types. So not surprisingly, there are many different ways to classify neighborhoods as urban or suburban or central or peripheral. But there are no golden standards to do so. So in this paper, we thought about two different kind of dimensions. One is kind of physical centrality. Another thing is suburban ways of living. So we have chosen the two because we are interested in both kind of location and then the character of neighborhoods to which millennials are moving. So it basically enables us to think about where millennials are moving in terms of, whether that is further from the city or closer city center, or if they're moving to neighborhoods that have more kind of urbanish or suburbanish kind of characteristics. So in doing so, we first consider neighborhood as central or peripheral based on distance from city center. Here we use relative kind of within metro distance percentiles, given that some metros like New York is huge, and then another metros like Milwaukee or Muncie are much more smaller than that kind of big metro. So we are kind of using the most closest 10%, 20%, 30%, and 100% based on their population, accumulated population. So the census tract that around the city center that holds about 30% of metro population are considered as central, and the rest of them are peripheral. We later tested robustness of these findings by using different thresholds, but the findings are generally pretty consistent across different definitions. In addition, we delineate urban and suburban neighborhoods using three indicators of suburban ways of living, which we adopted from, Marcus Moose and Mendez paper, 2015 paper. So they used three different variables. One was home ownership rate. Another was a share of homes that are single family. And the last one was a share of workers commuting by car. So and then we use a simplified version of this approach by classifying those neighborhoods with zero or just one variable that is greater than MSA average as just urban neighborhoods, which is shown in kind of really dark red and then kind of bright orange color on the left-hand side. And then those neighborhoods with two or more three variables that have greater value than MSA's average as suburban neighborhoods, which is in the kind of yellow and then dark brownish color. Again, we did some robustness check and our key findings are essentially unchanged. And we combine two dimensions, central, peripheral, and then urban, suburban, and here's the result for the New York metropolitan area. So you can see those bluish areas are kind of central area around urban center, and then greenish areas are kind of peripheral area, and then dark area are urban area, and lighter areas are kind of suburban area. So we can see that lots of the urban neighborhoods are central areas and suburban neighborhoods are peripheral area. But there's a considerable number of central suburban neighborhoods, which is kind of inner ring suburbs, or peripheral urban neighborhoods, which might be kind of transit centers or employment subcenters in those metros. And this is the map for Chicago, which is much more like monocentric city. So lots of the urban kind of central neighborhoods are overlapping each other, but still we can see substantial number of central suburban or peripheral urban neighborhoods. And this is map for DC area. You can see there are some urban neighborhoods in peripheral area along the line of red metro, silver line, and then orange line over there. And this is map for LA. You can see that, Santa Monica, Central Valley, Long Beach, that areas are not, central area, but they are kind of urban area in our definition. So with that, I'm going to show you our end result. So we basically analyzed the numbers and then shares of all the millennials in 2011 and 2021 across different neighborhood types and metro types. So on the left-hand side, you can see that they are grouped into like big metros, like top 50 metros, and then smaller metros. And then within each metros, there are central urban, central suburban, peripheral suburban, some other area that does not that are missing values, that have some missing values of have or having very low population count. Anyhow, in the left-hand side, you can see the number of population, about 40 million in 2011 and 42 million in 2021. And then right next to that, there's a population growth rate. And then we do have population share. So 100% in 2011, 100% in 2021, and difference in that kind of share. So shifts in the population distribution between 2011 and 2021. And the results indicate that millennial suburbanization has been underway. For example, as the early millennials age into their 30s and 40s, the population share in, say, peripheral suburban neighborhoods in the big metros or the 50 most populous metros and smaller metros increased by, say, 5.7 percentage points and 2.1 percentage points respectively, which is pretty substantial. And that gain in the millennial share in like peripheral suburban neighborhoods was at the expense of the decline in the share of among those urban neighborhoods, especially among central urban neighborhoods. Um, and then in aggregate, the share of early millennials in urban neighborhoods, including those central or peripheral area, um, declined from 42% to 34% in 2021. So the trend was pretty similar across all the metropolitan areas, while the magnitude of share changes were greater among the larger metros. And we compare these kind of millennial suburbanization patterns in 2010s with those earlier generations in 1990s and 2000s. I know there are so many numbers, so it's really hard to read. So I just made this really nice looking kind of graph in here. So it makes you feel much better, right? So here, what I want to emphasize is that we can notice that it is kind of natural for urban neighborhoods to lose some of those certain generation share when they are aged from 25 to 34 years old to 35 to 44. For example, the share of late boomers in urban neighborhoods declined by about 9.5 percentage points during 1990s. The share of Gen Xers declined by 8.2 percentage points in 2000, when the share of early millennials in urban neighborhoods, whether that is peripheral urban or central urban, declined by about 7.9 percentage points or 8 percentage points. But another notable difference across different generations is that the shares of early millennials in urban neighborhoods were greater than those among earlier generations, not only when they were 25 to 34 years old, but also when they were 35 to 44 years old. So when they were 24 to 34 years old, about 38 to 39% of late boomers or like Gen Xers were in urban neighborhoods, whereas 42.4% of the early millennials were in urban neighborhoods in 2010, 2011. And when they were 35 to 44 years old, the same thing can be found that early millennials are more likely to live in urban neighborhoods compared to earlier generations. All right, so that was about generational pattern. And then we want to think about what kind of neighborhoods attract the millennials the most and the least. In doing so, we basically classified all neighborhoods or census tracts in the United States into quintiles, saying top 20%, second quintile, third quintile, fourth quintile, and the bottom 20% in terms of gains in the share of early millennials from 2011 to 2021. Then we compared neighborhood characteristics of those top 20% neighborhoods with those neighborhood characteristics of the bottom 20% neighborhoods. And here are those results. Sorry that the numbers are difficult to read, but let me explain them as best as I can. So the top 20% neighborhoods, meaning that those gain the most millennial population share from 2011 to 2021, tend to have greater share of white population, have higher socioeconomic status, meaning that higher college graduate share, low poverty rate, income, higher income and housing prices, which is consistent with those housing or neighborhood characteristics in suburban neighborhoods. And especially when you see the greater share of owner-occupied homes, single-family homes, and auto commuters compared to bottom 20% and then average neighborhoods, it is pretty clear that it was suburban neighborhoods that attracted lots of the millennials. But when we think about what has happened in such neighborhoods, but the top 20% neighborhoods had relatively fewer neighborhood amenities, such as restaurants and bars, and grocery shops, and retail stores, banks, and museums, and other places. But when we think about what has happened in those top 20% neighborhoods, they changed a lot in terms of there has been some substantial changes in neighborhood characteristics in those top 20% neighborhoods. For example, the racial and ethnic diversity and housing diversity has increased in those top 20% neighborhoods. And then suburban indicators became much less pronounced over the 10 years. And growth rates of neighborhood amenities in the top 20% neighborhoods were pretty phenomenal. So the growth rate of those urban amenities were outpaced of those bottom 20% or other kind of four quintiles. So it was pretty clear that the neighborhoods where millennials moved has some neighborhood characteristics that were somewhat similar to suburban ways of living, but those neighborhoods appear to have adopted some kind of urban ways of living over time. And the bottom 20% of neighborhoods, meaning that those lost the millennial population share the most, tend to be kind of denser, have smaller share of children, have smaller share of white residents and homeowners, and have lower incomes and lower housing costs. And they tend to have higher population densities and greater access to neighborhood amenities. So these kind of neighborhood characteristics are consistent with urban central neighborhoods that experience substantial decline in the share of early millennial population during the period. So they have obviously very opposite characteristics. And the last and the most crucial question that we might have is why they are moving, why millennials are moving away from the central or urban area in general to suburban area. Unfortunately, we still cannot answer that question directly because we don't have any idea. I mean, the ACS or other data set does not ask people why they move, but only guess why they are moving based on kind of neighborhood context that they are moving. So here are some hints that we found. So while the ACS does not ask why people move, the CPS ASAC data does. So that is current population survey data set that has a questionnaire about why people move if they moved in within 12 months. And according to 2021 CPS ASAT data set, about half of those reasons that young adults, like 20 to 49, 30, 39, moved were housing related, meaning that they wanted to move to new or better housing, they wanted to achieve home ownership, or they wanted to move to cheaper housing unit, etc., etc. So given these kind of survey data set, we basically hypothesize that housing affordability and lack of housing units that accommodate changing demand or needs of millennials were one of the major reasons why they moved. So that kind of reasons played an important role in millennials' departure from, say, central urban neighborhoods or urban neighborhoods in general. So to test this idea, we basically categorize the top 50 metros into five groups by median housing cost in the MSA's urban central neighborhoods and share of housing units that has three or four bedrooms or more bedrooms in the urban central neighborhoods. So here's the list of the top 50 metros based on their housing costs in their central urban neighborhoods. So you can see that top 20 in the top 20% metros, you can see those coastal expansive cities like Boston, LA, New York. And then most affordable 20% includes those Midwestern or Southern kind of metros like Buffalo, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, they kind of cities. So top 20% are really expensive um, cities, and then bottom 20% are much more affordable metropolitan area. And then when we analyze the change in the share of total population, not just millennials, but total population between 2011 to 2021, you can see that the changes in total population share might not have any kind of very conclusive patterns across those top 20% to bottom 20%, they kind of quintile groups, right? So this is for total population. But when we analyze this for the early millennials, there's some kind of patterns that show up, right? For example, the share of early millennials tend to decline further in the urban central neighborhoods within those high housing cost metros, saying negative 1.47 percentage points, while the urban, suburban peripheral neighborhoods in such metros, top 20% metros, gain substantial share of early millennials, 1.64 percentage points. While the four neighborhood types in lower housing cost metros show somewhat similar patterns, but the magnitude is much smaller. So in the bottom 20% metros, that magnitude was negative 0.35 percentage points and zero point 0.6 percentage points in urban central and peripheral suburban neighborhoods. And then we basically repeat the analysis by the share of housing units with three or more bedrooms. Here's a list. So in the left-hand side, you can see top 20%, meaning that those metros that have greater share of housing units in their central urban neighborhoods that have three bedrooms or more bedrooms. It was Baltimore, Buffalo, Detroit, Riverside, they kind of cities that had greater share of homes with three or more bedrooms in their urban central neighborhoods. Whereas the bottom 20% neighborhood had fewer housing units that are having three or more bedrooms, meaning that they usually have like studios and one bedroom or two bedroom like apartment in their central urban neighborhoods. That includes like LA, New York, San Diego, and San Francisco, they kind of metropolitan areas. So when we did the same analysis for the total population, the patterns across housing cost quintiles is literally, limited. So there are some trends, but not very kind of conclusive or any kind of substantially different across different neighborhoods. But when we did for the early millennial population, so previously it was total population, and this is for early millennials from 2011 to 2021, we see that suburban share increased the most in the bottom 20% metros that has least large home options in their central urban neighborhoods. So mostly they have studios or one bedrooms or two bedrooms in their central urban neighborhoods, like New York, LA, that kind of cities. And urban share declined the most in such metros. Whereas the metros with lots of the housing options, larger home housing options with three or more bedrooms tend to have much smaller magnitude of declines and increases in urban and suburban neighborhoods respectively. In addition, we examined the association between the millennial share change, so that was dependent variable, millennial share change and neighborhood characteristics in 2011 using simple ORS regression. So we are not arguing that there's any kind of causal relationship between the two, but just wanted to see whether there's some correlation between the two. And the results suggest that controlling for metropolitan fixed effects and other neighborhood characteristics, the gain in the early millennial share in a certain census tract is negatively associated with median gross rent. So they lost millennial share if gross rent is higher and is possibly associated with the share of housing units with three or more bedrooms. So the census tract with more three or more bedrooms tend to attracted lots of the millennials between 2011 and 2021. I mean, we acknowledge that, this model does not offer any causal explanations, but the results are consistent with the idea or descriptive analysis that we shown before, saying that early millennials are moving out of central urban neighborhoods as those communities are youthified, meaning that they are, serving basically young adults, like 25 to 34. So they have lots of the studios, lots of the one bedrooms that have lots of, restaurant and the bars that serving that kind of young adults are not accommodate that they are failed to provide any affordable and spacious housing for those older people like 35 to 44 who have kids who may need more spaces in their home. So here's some conclusions and discussions, right? So it's about the end. So here's a summary of findings. Basically, what we found from this paper was how millennials are moving to peripheral suburban neighborhoods, um, and from central urban neighborhoods, which was kind of surprising to us. We expected millennials are moving to maybe peripheral area, but having more urbanish kind of characteristics. But it turned out that they're moving to such peripheral suburban neighborhoods. And the suburbanization pattern among millennials were pretty similar to those among earlier generations, like late boomers or Gen Xers. So as a millennials, we always thought we were different. We were different from our parents or from our uncles. But it turned out that we are exactly same in terms of we are moving out to suburban area, moving into single family homes, just like them. And but the level of urban presence at the ages of 25 to 34 and at the age of 35 to 44 was greater amongst the early millennials compared to the earlier generations like boomers and Gen Xers. That was pretty interesting to see. And when we think about what kind of neighborhoods are attracting those neighbors that attracted the early millennials typically are much more like, suburban-ish in their character, in terms of having greater share of white population, having greater home ownership rate, having greater, single family homes and more. But that kind of top 20% tracks tend to have um, less amenities as well. So it is indeed a little bit boring, a little bit dull place compared to urban neighborhoods. But over time, there's been some changes. So home ownership rate, single family share, auto commuter, all kind of share has declined in those top 20% neighborhoods. And when you think about neighborhood amenities, that the growth rate of those urban amenities was kind of phenomenal compared to bottom 20% or kind of in general, overall neighborhoods, neighborhoods. And when we think about why they moved, millennial suburbanization was the most pronounced in the metros with high cost, neighborhoods and the fewer large homes options in their central urban neighborhoods. So those youthified urban neighborhoods are failed to serve those older kind of not older, like middle-aged millennials anymore. So they had to move to suburban neighborhoods more when they cannot find any housing options, more affordable or more larger housing options. So, in terms of the policy implications, I would say that, millennials have started to move to suburban neighborhoods. If their presence may be reshaping these neighborhoods as well. So they are moving to little boring, dull suburban neighborhoods, but that neighborhoods have, with a lot of millennials, tend to have more and more kind of urbanish characteristics over time. So we'll see whether they can reshape the kind of formerly kind of more suburbanish neighborhoods. And then those youthified urban centers or youthified kind of metropolitan areas fail to retain and attract millennial population. So if those places they wanna attract or retain millennials, largely they are really good kind of taxpayers in their prime ages of their career. So if a certain cities or metros want to attract and retain those millennials, then they need to provide more affordable family-sized housing options, and maybe providing more family-friendly kind of amenities, and provide more access to home ownership opportunities. And with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation, and I'm happy to answer some of the questions or comments that you guys have. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a terrific presentation. I guess as a full-fledged baby boomer, I should say, welcome to the suburbs. We're happy to have you. A whole bunch of really interesting questions coming in, and again, apologies. We may not get to all of them. I'm wondering if you looked at any of potential differences among members of the millennial generation, and I'm thinking of, in particular, whether you see different patterns by race, by income, and by the type of household, particularly, one person, two person, and kids, and if for the last, kind of the number of kids. So you can take that as one whole or break it into several or however you want.
Right. So basically, what we used was public version of ACS dataset that does not allow us to, separate or stratify those millennials into, say, by their educational attainment, their income, or other dimensions. But one thing that we could do was doing this by race and ethnicity. So we thought maybe white millennials behave differently from black millennials, etc., etc. But I remember, unfortunately, we could not find very kind of clearly different pattern across different racial and ethnic group, but I should check. So that was a part of the reason why we are doing another analysis using the micro data set, so that we can analyze this by their income or their educational attainment. But what we are more interested in is by their industry or occupation, because maybe remote working make a huge difference in terms of their suburbanization patterns. So what we are interested in is maybe those in like IT industry or more likely to work from home are moving to exurban area, more kind of suburban Pera area also, but that'll be another paper, so stay tuned for that. I'm actually working with Whitney and Riordan on that as well, so we'll see.
So the answer is we don't know yet.
Yeah, yeah.
It might be coming. Couple of questions about what happened to the neighborhoods millennials moved out of, it looked like, at least in one of your tables, that those neighborhoods became much whiter. I'm not sure if I read that right, but in general, are they? So what happened in those? And one hypothesis is they continue to be youthified. What did you call them? Youthified neighborhoods. So that would be now where we would think Gen Z is living. Another explanation is that they might have totally gentrified and people like me are retiring into those communities. And I guess a third is that they're kind of coming down the socioeconomic ladder. And there's probably a fourth I didn't think of.
Right. So one thing that I want to emphasize is that although millennials moving out of urban kind of central neighborhood, that does not necessarily mean that it's end of the city or that of the urban kind of centers. They still attract lots of the younger kind of millennials. Basically means that those born between say 1985 to no 1996 to 2004, something like that. So Gen Zs or late millennials, so they are keep moving in to those urban centers and moving into those metros. So usually LA, Chicago, Boston, New York tend to attract lots of the 20 somethings, and then they lose 30 somethings. That happen amongst boomers, that happen among Gen Xers, and happen to early millennials. So there are still that youth places attract lots of the young people. But and I actually analyzed this for older adults as well. So meaning that if baby boomers are moving back to urban centers when they are downsized, unfortunately I couldn't find that kind of pattern. So it seems like they are aging in place or moving to somewhat kind of suburban-ish or peripheral-ish neighborhoods, not necessarily moving back to urban centers. So urban centers are more and more kind of youthified or stay youthified over time.
Your data goes through, I believe, 2021. So there's been some questions about whether you're picking up what we think were some pretty interesting shifts during and perhaps as a result of the pandemic. So both, does that seem to have fueled the move? Have you seen more recent data? And I was struck because you showed a decline, it looked like, in rural areas. The center has reported in at least some other places some recent growth in rural areas.
Right. So when we started our study, it was 2009 and 2019 data set. So that was kind of intact kind of period, right? So we could find somewhat similar patterns, but the magnitude was a little bit smaller than what we found based on 2011 to 2021 data set. So I would interpret that there was a certain pattern shown already, but that was much more accelerated after the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is consistent with the view that, many, millennials, boomers try to purchase their homes in suburban and exurban area when they are at the prime ages of home buying and interest rate was so low. And then many, firms and companies allowed them to work from home. And they desperately wanted to have backyard or swimming pool for their kids who do not attend their school. So I think pandemic accelerated many of the patterns that we see today, but that kind of pattern was already shown. Actually, Dahlmeyer's coined the term peak millennials when those millennials coming through the turning point of they become 35 or some 25 or something or 35 something that they become more and more millennials having the age group that usually have children, they get married, etc., etc. So that turning point was 2015. So I think that was the moment that millennials starting to move to suburban area.
Did you look at, and if you did you find any significant changes in the nature of suburbs? I mean, I was very struck by your finding about the growth of amenities in the peripheral suburbs. And the question is that unique that this group of people is sort of demanding that set of amenities, or again, is this a pretty typical pattern if we'd gone back and looked at other patterns of suburbanization?
Yeah, I mean, from our data set, we might not see any kind of clear pattern, but anecdotally, we saw some of the newspaper articles saying that some Hudson Valley kind of cities or some exurbs attracted lots of the, chefs, like, those chefs worked at, downtown hotel are opening their restaurants in suburban areas or exurban areas, or some art galleries or yoga studios are booming in that kind of area. So it seems like some of millennial kind of taste and preferences or influences on their urban amenities, type of the urban amenities and type of the urban neighborhood characteristics as well. So that they are really kind of reshaping, but the magnitude we see.
Interesting. Interesting. I don't think you covered this, uh, and correct me if I'm wrong. Do you have a sense when we're looking at these millennial moves, to what extent are they basically within the same urban area? And to what extent are these, am I leaving Manhattan for the Hudson Valley or am I leaving Manhattan for Raleigh-Durham?
I might not be able to do that with ACS dataset that currently I do have, but actually Riordan have IRS dataset who can analyze how many people are moving from, say, California to Texas or New York to Florida, that kind of thing. So in this paper, we cannot say a lot about that, but basically what I found was those metros that attracted millennials the most are A, Texan or Florida cities. B, the satellite metros of New York area. So Allentown, I cannot remember another name, but they're kind of satellite metros of New York. So people in Manhattan maybe move to exurbs the area. And then C was some techie cities in mountain regions or west kind of southern regions, like Utah, like Provo, or some other kind of techie kind of cities in that kind of places. So they are leading that kind of movement. So I would not surprised to see many movement from New York to satellite metros or New York to Florida or from LA to San Francisco to somewhat techie cities like Denver or Colorado Springs or that kind of places.
Interesting. You probably went into this with some sense of, we always start our research with some sense of what we think is going on. And I'm wondering, is there anything in your research in particular that really surprised you, either in terms of, this is just completely opposite of what I expected, or where you found something that you thought was going on, but the magnitude was either much, much greater or much, much less than what your kind of intuition and your previous research had told you?
Right. So when we started this analysis, when we started to analyze, classify neighborhoods into four pieces: central urban, central suburban, peripheral urban, peripheral suburban, we wanted, not we expected, actually wanted to see the movement from central urban area to peripheral urban area. We wanted to argue that millennials are different. Millennials are moving to much more urbanish area, which has more dense kind of building environment, and then have much more kind of mass transit options, etc., etc. But it turned out that how many times we tried doing this way, that way, it turned out that lots of the millennials are actually moving to peripheral suburban area. So at that part, I was a little bit disappointed because I wanted to argue that millennials are different from boomers and Gen Xers, but it turned out that we are exactly same, just like them. But another thing that we found was the level of urban presence was still greater almost millennials. So many millennials, maybe, you know, never married millennials or millennials with no kids or less kids are still living in urban central areas because the marital rate is much lower, almost millennials. Or and the fact that lots of the millennials are actually reshaping those previously boring and dull suburban areas that might explain a little bit about how they interact with that kind of neighborhood characteristics. Maybe they found the house they loved in per suburban area, but given that they still want to go to, say, yoga studio, they still have some, avocado toast. Maybe kind of new restaurants are opening up in that kind of areas, serving their kind of demands and other things.
Interesting. Are you seeing, and again, this may not have shown up in your data, to the I'm assuming your findings are right. It's clear that this isn't, I'm assuming in part, people moving off into new housing because if it's on the periphery. Is there any evidence of any significant changes in the way that housing is being developed, be it density, be it the kind of amenities that are coming with the housing?
Yes, that is another piece that we need to answer with micro data set because that has specific housing characteristics that millennials are moving in, right? So we can identify whether that was a new home housing, whether that has 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom, whether that is built um, in 10 years old, 20 years old, something like that. What we can see is only the neighborhood characteristics, which is just kind of about the neighborhood level. So we cannot answer with the current data set, but definitely our one of the hypotheses is that given the given the fact that lots of the old existing homes were already occupied by baby boomers or earlier generations who are enjoying this kind of low interest rate. Um, so many of millennials had to find kind of newly built homes which tend to be located in kind of exurban area or suburban area. So that was a part of the reason why they are living in there. But we'll see. We need additional analysis to answer that kind of question.
Yep. Interesting question just came in. Wondering if you've had any opportunity to compare what you've been seeing in the U.S. with patterns in other advanced industrial countries. So the kind of suburbanization patterns among millennials relatively similar if I look across other countries.
So housing affordability has been getting worse and worse in South Korea and many other countries as well, right? There's been some level of housing bubble in many countries as interest rate goes down. So people are desperate to find their homes. But in South Korea, it is much more like urbanish area rather than suburban area. So part of the reason why is in Korea, still many are working at office. They have to commute. So given the fact that they have to work 5 days a week at their office, it's really hard for them to living in really urban area, spending an hour or two every day. So that might be a little bit different. But in the United States and Canada, I think we saw quite similar patterns in there as well.
Interesting. Interesting. Do you have any sense what's happening with you focused quite appropriately on the older millennials? I'm wondering if you've had any chance to look at younger millennials or even Gen Z to see. I mean, I take it it's an implication here that the younger millennials and Gen Z are probably going to go into the cities and then at some point depart. But I don't know what you're starting to see or what you expect to see.
Yeah, I actually did this analysis for Gen Zs in the previous article, like 2022 article at International Journal of Urban Sciences. And it seems like they are doing exactly same what early millennials they did. But we'll see what they will do in their, mid 30s. But so far, they have exactly same patterns in terms of the share of a certain cohort living in urban neighborhoods. So that increased pretty rapidly over time when they are 20 somethings, but they are at late 20s right now. So it's really, we need 4 or 5 years more to see whether they follow exactly what we did before. So they may complain about they are old-fashioned maybe 4 years later, 5 years later.
Yeah. And just to go back a question I meant to ask you earlier, if we look at when the millennials are making this move to the suburbs, is it happening at roughly the same age as previous generations, or I've been under the impression that they're doing the same thing. Millennials have been doing the same thing as previous generations, but often doing it a little bit later.
Yep. So previously, I used a CPS data set to calculate the share of each generation living in multi-family units, 5+ units, which is proxy for urban kind of living. And that was kind of invert, kind of U-shaped. And the peak age was 26 or 27. So it increases over time at the age of 26 and 27. And that was peak of the share of people who are living in multi-family housing units and goes down. And that looked like this. So the peak age was exactly same at the age of 26, 27, but the level of in terms of the share of people living in multi-family unit has been much higher and higher amongst the younger generation. So which is pretty consistent with what we found here, right? So people living in urban neighborhoods. So I think that kind of peak age is about the same across different generations.
Well, fascinating. We've got more questions, but we've about hit the end of our time. Um, just want to make sure if there was any kind of a key point that you want to make sure that we leave with, or that you wanted to make sure got discussed that we didn't ask you before we sign off. Any
No, I think all the questions were really kind of comments were really good, and that really kind of motivates me and hopefully Whitney and Riordan as well to doing another analysis on another kind of paper based on micro data sets. So stay tuned. So and then if you guys have any kind of questions and comments, I showed my email address and Whitney Riordan's email address as well. So just shoot me an email so that we can address them appropriately. So thank you.
Yeah, no, this was, as I mentioned at the start, we got to know you several years ago as a postdoc coming out of a doctoral program, starting a really interesting course of research, around that really was about demographics, which is one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to. And it's been really not only a joy, it's just been a great kind of intellectual journey to watch this body of research unfold. This is consistent, as you mentioned, with other work you've done. And I think you're right that the micro data and being able to distinguish among, millennials is a pretty broad, it's a generation, and there's clearly a lot of variation. So really understanding that, and where we're going is critical. We were excited way back when to support, some of your research. We've been thrilled and fascinated as it's continued, and I look forward to hosting you again in a few years with another piece of research. But for now, on behalf of the many people who've been online, and many others who will watch, just want to thank you for a terrific and really thought-provoking presentation. Everybody have a great day, and we'll see you, as it were, in a week for our next in our series of fall events. Thanks a lot. Have a great afternoon.
Right. Thank you.